You good, Erin?
Yep.
All right. All right, I think we'll get started. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being with us. Happy 2021, a year that I know everyone was anxious to get started. Hopefully it'll improve sooner rather than later. We're very happy that you all are with us tonight. As some of you heard me say, the crazy news of the day may be preventing some of those who registered from being with us tonight. We did have a pretty good number registered. We were looking forward to a nice crowd, but I've heard from at least one person that they just couldn't, they canceled because they just were otherwise preoccupied, understandably. So we welcome you for this, what we hope will be a light, informing, and engaging, entertaining hour. And Brad, the show is yours, and you can introduce our special guest tonight. You're muted. You're muted. Okay, now you're unmuted.
Someone muted me without my knowledge. Hey, welcome to everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. I have my good friend Thomas Lockyer is our special guest. He has worked up and down the Keys. Currently, he is the manager of the Museum of the Everglades for Collier County. Prior to that, he's worked in Key West at the Shipwreck Museum, at Ghosts and Gravestones.
Yes, I did Ghosts and Gravestones there.
Pirate Soul Museum.
Pirate Soul Museum.
Pigeon Key. History of Diving Museum.
All sorts of things up and down, yeah.
So we got lots of areas of interest, lots of topics that we can talk about. Wrecking, we can talk pirates, we can talk general Florida Keys history, Pigeon Key, so many things, so many opportunities. So if anybody has any questions and wants to get started, just raise your hand and we'll get that going. In the meantime, also, Thomas was the one who recommended me for this job many, many years ago. And I'm very thankful that he sat down with the board 8 years ago, over 8 years ago, I think. And said, how about that guy, Brad Bertelli, who's writing columns for the paper?
I said, that's your man. And see, I was right. It's one of those rare moments when I've made that perfect recommendation.
And I'm very appreciative. All right. So, so Thomas, what is the biggest difference you think between where you're living in the Everglades now as opposed to when you were living out here in the Keys, down here in the Keys?
There are a lot of similarities to it. I mean, it's interesting for me because the story of how I ended up there when my wife and I used to actually go to Everglades City for Valentine's Day. We did it like 3 years in a row. Because, if you live in the Keys, what little funky Florida town do you go to when you're trying to get off the rock? And we stumbled on Everglades City, and we would go and we'd have Valentine's Day dinner at the Rod and Gun Club. I had visited the museum and thought it was, nice little museum, never in a million years imagining that I would end up taking the position there, but here I am.
And one of the nice things about all the museums are pretty, we're all pretty connected. And so I'm able to reach out to Thomas for questions, to either of the Corys down in Key West, either at the Art and Historical Society or at Mel Fisher. And it's so nice to have a group of people that you can, reach out to, and Thomas reaches out to me, and it's a great relationship.
Yeah, I think that Florida's really good in that way with museum professionals, whether or not people are involved with Florida Association of Museums. There's just kind of a general underlying, let's help each other out, let's lift each other up sort of thing, and you have a lot of peers that you can rely on. And I've made some blind calls to people about right now I'm kind of working on something to do with commercial fishing and going up to the Maritime Museum in Cortez and things like that, and reaching out to them and saying, hey, what do you know about mullet fishing? What can you help me with that? And it's really good to have resources all over the state.
All right, if anybody has any kind of questions for Thomas or for myself, please raise your hand, point at us, unmute yourself, and just speak out. Chris Brault, good to see you, clean shaven.
Guys, I had a topic, this is Erin, that I briefly caught while we were getting ready and you two were talking before everyone joined us. I heard you say something about the Gladesman culture and the fact that it is, I believe, a distinct culture. Can you talk a little more about that? It's not something I'd really given a lot of thought to before, but
Sure.
I'm learning more.
Yeah, and it's something that I was saying that one of the local guys kind of was taking me to school on it, and his family's been in the Everglades area since the mid 1800s, and really part of the whole Glades culture. And he was the one that said, just to reiterate what I was saying, is that he said, we're a real culture. It's like Cajun. There's just it's not a name that you've heard as much. We have our own kind of cooking. We have our own kind of music that we play. We, build certain kinds of boats. We hunt a certain way. And, I was kind of going along with it because I certainly, when I was living in the Keys, I certainly met people who wore their conkdom on their sleeve and said, I kind of think that for those of us who were born here, it should be kind of like the Indian reservation. We should have different rules and laws than everybody else. And I was like, okay. And that's not necessarily what these guys are saying, but they want to preserve the traditions. And it's interesting as a guy who 4 years ago came in and didn't really know that much about it, or what I did know about the Everglades area was from the standpoint of a Keys historian and what the connections of the mainland were. There, as far as how you would necessarily define it, it's one of those, you got to read the book. There is a great book called Gladesman, and I'm losing who the author is right now, but he did a tremendous amount of work with different Florida historical societies. If you go on Florida Memory, there are lots and lots of things, the photographs and even oral histories that were collected along those lines. I mean, it's a whole treasure trove that you never would have imagined, and including everything down to the actual templates that they used to do boat building. So. But, certainly there are aspects that you would expect, that include moonshining, gator poaching, going back to, plume hunting, but Everglades City has an interesting past in that it's kind of interwoven with a more or less an outlaw mentality. But as you really start to unpack and dissect the history of it, you understand how that stuff really happened, and that you had people who were subsistence livers, and every time that they kind of got a leg up and started, finding a way of making a living and doing a little better, it seemed like the government or somebody else came in and made a rule or a law against what they were doing and changed everything for them. And the culture kind of grew up with an attitude toward the law and government and law enforcement, and you see it in old movies about mountain people, and the Hatfield and McCoy type, legendary struggles, and there's that sort of stuff in Everglades. And then, like I said, that I get a lot of people coming into the museum that say, oh, well, isn't Everglades the place where that huge drug bust happened? Smuggling has been part of the culture pretty much since people started building shacks along the coast there.
It seems it would be a really cool exhibit to do a conch culture versus glades culture kind of thing.
There you go.
That would be a fun one. Maybe we do that together.
And you know, there's definitely an interconnection. One of the founding families, the Storter family, that came in and built the home that eventually was expanded to become the Rod and Gun Club. You know, it was basically two brothers, one that was running a general store on the river and the other that was running the boat back and forth for supplies, which was to Key West. So there was always a connection with Key West and Keys culture, and you see a lot of the same names as you look back through the histories, and it's like, oh, I knew some of those people down in the Keys. You know, especially a lot of Middle Keys family names.
Santini comes to mind.
Well, and Santini was in Everglades originally. You know, he's the guy that our infamous Edgar Watson supposedly slit his throat and he survived. So and Santini made Watson pay him $800 to not press charges, and then used all that money to buy his property in the Keys.
And for those of you who don't recognize the name Santini, and there have been several families. I think they were also from Fort Myers area as well. A lot of mullet fishing. But Milton Santini, who was from that branch, was the gentleman who first kind of perfected the art of catching dolphins. And he was the one who caught Mitzi, who later became, world famous flipper. And his home was where the Dolphin Research Center is today on Grassy Key. And there were some members of the Santini family living up in Tavernier as well. So there is always lots of connections between all these boating cultures, these early boating cultures.
Thomas, is the book that you were talking about by Gladesmen, Gator Hunters, Moonshiners, and Skiffers?
That's the one.
By Glenn Simons?
Yeah, Glenn Simmons. That's the one.
All right, just in case anyone wanted to know.
Yeah, and you put his name in there, and like I said, if you go into Florida Memory Project, the state archives, vast treasure trove of stuff that he collected. But I was even mentioning to Brad that the fellow that was turning me on to this, whose family has been there for so long, recently sent me a link to a study that was done by the National Park Service about whether or not Gladesman was actually a culture, and this is, I believe, back in the late 80s, and that they determined absolutely that it was.
Bruce, I saw you had a question. Why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself? There you go.
A little out of the box question. I live in Fort Lauderdale for decades. Discovered the Keys about 20 years ago, and it's definitely an addiction. So if I come down here less than once a week, I start shaking. So it's an addiction. So I'm just curious. Do we know, after God created heavens and earth, do we know when the first time that the Keys were inhabited by humans? When and how did that happen?
We would go back well over 1,000 years to the Aboriginal people, who I think about 16,000 years ago they first entered Florida. Thomas, if you hear me say something wrong, feel free to.
History changes because there are now some of the sites that they've found that are disrupting the idea that it was migratory people that came to Florida. Now that they're finding sites that predate that migration and thinking that, well, was this the original Eden? Did life start in Florida? So,
I don't know about that, yeah. But it definitely goes back well over 1,000 years.
Wow.
There's sites in Key Largo at the where the Colusa campground is.
Yeah.
And that was a pretty remarkable. There are over 175 prehistoric Aboriginal or Indian sites in Monroe County and the Florida Keys. So there's a heavy presence of and you can go back to Ponce de Leon and the 1500s, talking about these Aboriginal cultures down here, but as far as like carbon dating or and looking at some of the artifacts coming out of these Indian mounds, these shell middens, date back, over 1,000 years. So it's a pretty long, very long, significant history. And what's interesting, it only took about from like 1500 to 1760, after the introduction of European cultures, to basically eradicate the Aboriginal culture from the Florida Keys and from South Florida.
But the Colusa people fought a 200-year fight against the Spanish, and you have to give them kudos for that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, they held off for quite a while.
That was in the 1500, correct? Roughly.
Well, that was 1513 is the initial contact that we know of.
Wow, thank you. Interesting, fascinating.
Thank you for your question.
Jeff had the hand raised. I just want to make sure you guys saw that. Jeff, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Sure, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm a local, newly seated local guide in Key Largo, and I've been using a piece of history that I found on Wikipedia that I'd like to get confirmed.
Wikipedia, awesome. All right.
Yeah, but you have to be careful, right, when you look at things on the internet. But I had heard something called the Key Largo Temple Mound, and it's reportedly a Smithsonian agreed upon Mayan ruin in Key Largo. Can you comment at all on that?
I would be happy to comment that it's nothing Mayan related. That was the mound that I was talking about at the Colusa campground area. And there were 3 significant mounds or features that were found at that site. 2 measuring about there were 2 Indian mounds measuring about 150 feet by about 75 feet, somewhere in that area, and then a kidney-shaped mound that is considered to be one of more of a ceremonial mound. But this would be, dating back, this would be more connected to the Tequesta or the Colusa or the the Tequesta and the Colusa weren't the Aboriginal people living in the Keys. The Tequesta were more along the Miami River and Key Biscayne area. The Colusa more Southwest Florida, where Thomas is, but there were several cultures down here in the Florida Keys. One being the Matacumbe culture, and these would have, but the site, the temple mound you're talking about, is there about mile marker 103 or wherever Colusa campground is. But that is one of the most significant prehistoric Indian sites in Florida, in the Florida Keys. But you got to be careful of Wikipedia. Of Mayan culture, there's no indication of that whatsoever.
And
okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, not to go all ancient aliens on you there, but there is, a lot of anthropologists and archaeologists do disagree on this stuff, and there is something that they refer to as Mississippian culture, and that there are mound builders that they believe are connected and related that have similar sites going, from Florida all the way up through Wisconsin. And I've had the pleasure of visiting a number of those sites, and I've also been to Chichen Itza, so I have something to compare to as far as it being Mayan, and I can see how they would say that there's a large flat-topped temple mound on one side, smaller flat-topped temple mound with a huge plaza in between. There are definitely similarities in the layout and coastal geography, those sorts of things with Mayan culture, and different people have different theories about it. The site Aztalan in Wisconsin, actually, one of the excavations that they did brought up what they believed was a priestess who had a shawl made completely of shells that were all saltwater seashells. So, in the middle of Wisconsin, there's some sort of connection somehow You know, does that mean that they were actually Mayans that you know, made their way up? There are probably, you know, 50 to 100 books that will tell you that's exactly what it was, and certainly several TV shows. But you know, the interesting thing with Wikipedia, what I always like to do is see where it's got the footnote, go straight to the references and start picking at the references. And once you know, click on those references, and even if you go to Amazon and look at it and say, well, that looks like a, you know, National Enquirer type Weekly World News book, you know, you don't want to judge a book by its cover, but you can usually start to tell whether it's a you know, it's an academic work that has respected anthropologists involved with it. But it's definitely it's an area that nobody has any really solid answers for. No written record for the most part with these places.
And one of the problems with Wikipedia is anybody can go on that site and edit it. So one of the you know, I call them grandpa stories. So grandpa tells you a story, and then you grow up hearing that, and you tell that story, and that story you grew up hearing, so that becomes your truth. And so anybody with an idea can go on Wikipedia and put that down there, or in other cases, that becomes a place where these stories that are passed around that are not, you know, fact checked, that are not, you know, based in any kind of historical record, but more of a theoretical or more of a legendary or lore that, you know, gets passed around, and a lot of people talk about it, and it gets put in print on Wikipedia, and then, you know, every once in a while you'll see a writer who quotes or uses Wikipedia as a source, and anybody who understands, you know, sees that, you know, flags go off real quick. But the other thing I want to say is, even in the mountains you'll find seashells. You know, there's always evidence, because at one point it was all underwater. So you do find, even like I'm from California, and walking around, you know, the Sierra Madres or whatever mountains, you know, sometimes you come across seashells, because there's always a deposit somewhere. Ellen has a question. Ellen, you want to unmute yourself?
Okay. First of all, Thomas, I think the first thing I need to say is thank you so much for recommending Brad. What an addition he's been to our museum. I'm visiting this from Wisconsin. So could you repeat again, Thomas, the name of the city? Did you say Ashland?
Aztalan.
Aztalan.
Yeah, it's between. It's closer to Madison than Milwaukee, but it's in between there, and it's pretty much like it sounds. Aztlan.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, I'm a Wisconsin native, by the way.
Oh, where are you from?
Born in Madison, but I lived 8 years in Kenosha. I've, you know, bounced around a little bit.
Oh, okay. All right, thank you.
Meredith, did you have a hand raised? And good to see you, by the way.
Hey, I saw you in the Rob Riggle show.
Wasn't I wonderful?
Black Caesar. You were.
He was great.
I recommend it. It's easy to find, too.
Thank you.
And we show it here in the theater.
Do you? Okay. Yeah, I recommend it. It's fun. I love pirate stuff. However, Jill, I don't know what news of the day you were referring to. So I'm going to spitball it here and say maybe it's about politics or a pandemic. So pretty much the only thing I know about politics and illness is that the white man brought illness and that there's a chief. And is there anything else we know about the political structure of the tribes back then? And other than, they got wiped out, is there anything written about how they handled the illnesses and what was coming at them? Or-
Fontaneda memoir is probably the definitive text, and you know, since I've been filling my head with Glades culture, I probably can't give you the right numbers, but Fontaneda was shipwrecked, and he spent 17 years, something like that.
Right. About 1549 shipwreck, rescued in 1575 by Pedro Menendez. Wrote not 1575. No, somewhere around there. But he published a memoir in 1575, also the year he died, documenting his time he spent living with the Colusa, largely with the Colusa. But he would interact with many of the Aboriginal tribes. And in those days, because the Colusa settled on the west coast and southwest Florida, they settled on a very location. And they settled on what's the estuary? I can't think of the estuary there.
What, up by me?
Yeah, Marco Island. Between Marco Island and Charlotte Harbor is.
Well, I mean, what, Shark River or?
No, I'm thinking just the broad expanse for that. Anyways, it was very rich in food, and it was very easy to access food. So they didn't have to expend a lot of energy harvesting food, and they could concentrate on doing other things of a more political nature. And they became the most politically dominant of the early Aboriginal people in the area, and they pretty much ruled, Port Charlotte, Lake Okeechobee, down to the Keys, and other tribes would pay them tribute. So they would come down, down to the Keys, and the Matacumbe people would pay them a tribute. The Tequesta would pay them a tribute. So they were the most politically dominant force, at least for a period of time. As far as the, and as far as illness, coming in, that's the downfall of many early tribes. And there's, and to go into political issues, even during the settling the American West, the Americans would put smallpox in blankets and then give those blankets to the Aboriginal, to the Indians as a way to, help conquer the area. Thomas?
Yeah, I mean, I love the Fontaneda memoir because I think it helps you get a lot of context. But I always think of him in the way of like Wesley with the Dread Pirate Roberts and in The Princess Bride. That it's like, oh, great job today, Wesley. I may kill you tomorrow though, because Fontaneda was a slave, and so they had him for a long time, but they kept took really good care of him, except when they didn't. But it's interesting stuff, and I think that like Brad was saying, that we know that the Spanish wrote records where the Colusa were giants, and they were maybe a few inches taller than the average European, but they were big and muscular and very healthy because they lived on a pure protein diet. Like he was saying, that the Colusa are unique in that they didn't even have agriculture because they didn't need it. There was enough, if they wanted fruits or vegetables or something, there's stuff around, but there was so much shellfish, other kinds of fish. Everything was just
deer, alligator.
Yeah, everything was there for the plucking, and I think that it's interesting to note when we talk about their healthy diet and their size and strength that as soon as Fontaneda got back to Europe, he died. He lived this long, healthy life with these guys, and once he got back to a filthy European city, he got sick and died almost immediately. It had that effect on him in the same way that European contact, was devastating to the Aboriginal people here.
I like to use this comparison when you're talking about, because there is that mythology of the 8-foot Colusa, which is totally unfounded. But you figure the average European male in the 15th and 16th century was about 5'5", and your average Aboriginal closer to 6 foot. So if you ever watch The Big Bang Theory, and you watch, which is the sitcom, Johnny Galecki, or Yeah, the two male leads, Sheldon is about 6'1", would stand about the size of your average or Aboriginal person. And then Leonard, who is his roommate, is 5'5", would stand about the height of your average European. So if you ever watched that show and watched their interaction, they were definitely taller, and they're definitely, and Fontaneda describes them as, tall and powerfully built with, great, and the women had great countenances. It's very specific on several issues, but they weren't like these massive 8-foot tall giants. They were just taller.
And I gotta give a little plug for the but our Collier County Museum system is 5 museums, and which are all free. And I'm not plugging mine, I'm actually plugging the Marco Island Museum, because I have one case of replica Colusa tools and things like that. They have an entire Colusa village that you walk through with recreations of daily life, and they do a lot. They've done incredible research, and they explore everything down to the spirituality of the Colusa. And right now they actually have 4 artifacts from the original archaeological expedition that happened on Key Marco. And that area that I come from, it was called the Pepperhurst Expedition, 1895. And among a lot of archaeologists, it's kind of like the King Tut of North America. They brought up over 4,000 artifacts from this single dig, and all these things were immersed in muck. It was very unique in the geology and the environment that these things were preserved in. That they were bringing up wooden things. They were even bringing up nets, and a lot of it disintegrated shortly after it hit the air. But they got evidence of how this culture, the different artifacts that they made, and how they were put together. Wells Sawyer was the artist that they brought along with them initially to take pictures, but he was also an artist. And rather than being the guy that sets up the big tripod camera and tries to take the unexposed plates and shoot pictures of things that are decomposing in front of your eyes, he got out his palette and painted watercolors of a lot of these artifacts that were disintegrating. So we do even know what color they were when they came out of the ground, and a lot of those paint schemes have been lost over time, but we have an original record from when they first were unearthed, and that's pretty neat. But yeah, come to Collier County, because if you spend a few days there, one of the things that you don't have to spend money on is museum admission. And nothing against you guys, because we are government supported. We are not nonprofit institutions that are well worth every cent of your admission. But take advantage of what Florida tax dollars are doing, and come visit our museums.
Thank you for that clarification, Thomas.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
That's all true. It's all true.
I have a question, Brad.
Yes.
Were there ever any evidence of the Colusa on Indian Key?
There was one. Well, Colusa. There was one prehistoric Indian mound found on the islands. And maybe a small scatter site, and there was one Indian mound out there. Non-culture, I'm not sure who it belonged to, but you also have to go back to the name Indian Key. Obviously, the name probably became, it first shows up in print in 1775 on a chart. And it probably became, and while there's no clear story about how the island got its name, there was an association between Indians and that island. And because Indian Key was a place where early European sailors, going back to the 16th century, would stop to get fresh water on nearby Lower Matecumbe Key, there was probably some kind of bartering system going on early on between the Europeans, the sailors, and the Indians on the island. So there was never, because there was several large communities, you know, just on Lower Matacumbe Key, in the parking lot of Robbie's was once an Indian mound there, also where the freshwater source was, 5 freshwater wells that were considered by some to be the most reliable source of fresh water in the Florida Keys. Also on Upper Matacumbe Key, there are still to this day one of the best preserved, you know, Indian sites in the area. It's the kind of behind Papa Joe's. It's protected and private. You can't go out there, but there's an Indian mound there the size of a football field. So there was a very significant Indian presence in the area, but not necessarily on Indian Key. Indian Key probably would have acted more as a hunting and fishing kind of a short-term locale.
I was wondering, you know, between there and Lingamviti, because of the two keys being in such close proximity.
And again, and significant Indian mounds. There's even a burial mound located on Lingamviti Key.
Huh.
You know, and which is, and because the Aboriginal people didn't really bury their dead, they were more left out. At least in the Keys, were kind of left out as an offering. So only like the, you know, the chief or the shaman were really buried, you know, buried along, kind of like as he was talking about the King Tut earlier, you know, buried along with, you know, possessions and things that were important.
Huh. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. And all right.
Brad, I have a question. You've, in several of our discussions in your lectures, you've mentioned the freshwater source on Lower Matacumbe Key. But, you know, when you're traveling amongst the Keys, at least, you know, from our view today, it doesn't seem like, you know, the geology is that different. What, do you know what allowed that freshwater source to be so reliable? Was it, you know, were they wells that were dug and they were just able to tap into the aquifer there? Or was it some naturally occurring freshwater source?
There were several naturally occurring sources. And so it was, you know, it was the Biscayne aquifer that kind of flows beneath us. And it did bubble. There were areas where it bubbled up. Bahia Honda had a nice freshwater source. Key West had you know, the Pirates Well, they call it. There were several freshwater sources. There were actually 3 that have been identified on Lower Matacumbe. And even as late as the 1930s, 1940s, when William Stark, who was the, you know, the one who first had Robbie's, who they're the family who built the Huntley Tarp. They were the Starks were the first family, the first full-time residents on Lower Matacumbe Key in late 1930s, 1940s. But there was still remnants of some water coming up from the ground, not necessarily from those early 5 freshwater wells that were largely destroyed during the construction of Henry Flagler's Railroad. Also, as South Florida is further developed and when they started to mess with the Everglades, you know, the water, you know, the water level kind of went down. And so some of this freshwater sources, you know, disappeared in that way. But there's even because if you look back, you know, if you look back, Henry Prine talks about his Ferry Grotto, which was located probably a mile south of where Robbie's is. There were the 5 freshwater wells in the Robbie's parking lot. There was the Prine's Ferry Grotto, but also another water source that was closer to, on the other side of the highway, kind of closer to the water. So there was definitely, the aquifer was definitely, you know, coming up higher in that area. Where it all went to, when it all went down, I'm not, you know, I don't know for sure. But there is definitely something, because there was one freshwater source. Henry Prine's son did some investigating on Upper Matacumbe Key and came across a freshwater freshwater, you know, area. But when he came back to tell, you know, this was during the occupation of, you know, Tea Table Key, and tried to tell the naval occupation, and tried to tell the Navy personnel there that he found fresh water. When he went back to look for it, couldn't show them where it was. But Lower Matecumbe Key seems to be a special case, and so the water, was more accessible kind of in that area than it was in other, because there's no record of on Plantation Key of any freshwater source. There's some on Key Largo. Winley Key, there's no record of a freshwater source. So they were rare up and down the keys. There's only a handful that have been identified. And this is from charts, from the 1800s and 1700s and before. I don't know if that helps, if I'm just rambling.
Well, the geology of the keys changes about halfway point, doesn't it?
Big Pine, yeah.
Yeah.
And also, because we're based on, on a fossilized system of coral reefs, on limestone, very porous, and so very open for water coming up and water going down. When it rains, except for the poor family at the end of my street, which always floods, even after a small rain. All right. Yes, Marie. Go ahead and there you go.
You just said that geology changes. I was under the impression that the entire keys were a fossilized coral reef. So where does the geology change?
I was just writing about this, and then pipe in Thomas, it's about Big Pine Key, where there's two kinds of limestone. There's oolite and the other one I can't think of. But here in the Upper Keys, it's more directly the fossilized corals. And then about Big Pine down further, there is the oolite, the Miami oolite. I think I'm not sure off the top of my head. Gets covered up by another, but so the whole thing is fossilized coral reef. But around Big Pine Key, it becomes covered with another substance that I can't think of off the top of my head. So it's not, but the core of the entire, from the Dry Tortugas to Key Biscayne, or Northern Keys, Elliott Key, and that area is basically all fossilized, all part of an ancient coral reef system. The modern coral reef is only about 7,000–8,000 years old, somewhere in that area. So the modern reef is pretty modern, and which is why like going to the Winley Key Fossil Reef Geological State Park, such an amazing place to go, because you can see firsthand the thin layer of topsoil and to think about how thin the topsoil is, and all these trees. Because you think of when trees grow, that their roots grow down, but they really, in our subtropical hammocks, all the roots kind of go out, which is not great when the hurricanes come through and things start to topple. Thomas, did you have anything to?
No, I mean, again, it's one of those things where 10 years ago, I had all that stuff right there, but now it's. It's been filled with
Glades culture.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting though, because the limestone is such a common denominator and significant characteristic. One of the great stories from where I am, the museum that I serve, is the Tamiami Trail, the highway that was built across the Everglades. And one of the stories that we tell, where I kind of tie different museum work that I've done in. I used to be the director of tours and the curator at Pigeon Key, and I came there and I didn't know anything about the Henry Flagler railroads, and it really became something that became close to my heart. But when Flagler originally looked at building the railroad down to Key West, they were exploring different possibilities, and cutting through the Everglades and jumping off at Cape Sable made a lot more sense, because they could use a lot more land and not have to build as many bridges. But Flagler's guys went out there and they got lost and they had to be rescued and came back. And I think the great quote is, Mr. Flagler, there's not enough fill on the face of the earth to build a railroad through the Everglades. And then somehow 12, 15 years later, Baron Gift Collier is building a highway across them. And how is he doing this? And the way they're doing it is they're making their own fill. You know, they're drilling down through the 8-10 feet of muck into the limestone caprock and sticking dynamite in there, blasting it up, and bringing these huge boulders up to make the roadbed for the Tamiami Trail. So it's, you know, it's the limestone, and the interesting similar stories with different entrepreneurs going different directions, but by you know, with different forms of transportation.
Thank you.
Did that help, Marie?
Yeah, thank you. I also have a quick question for Thomas. What kind, you are in Everglades City.
I am.
Is the museum, and the museum is there. So what kind of exhibits do you have there?
The museum itself is a historic structure. It's on the National Register. It was built in the early 1920s, well, opened in October of 27 as a commercial laundry. So one of the main focuses of the museum is kind of telling the story of Everglades City and the surrounding area. You know, and that has its own chapters. Obviously, you know, different stories of the indigenous people, the Aboriginal people, then the Seminole, and, you know, the European pioneers that eventually settled in the area. In 1921, we had our millionaire tycoon, Baron Collier, come in and decide to turn the town into a base of operations for building the highway across Florida. So we tell all those stories, but we also have our front gallery is a rotating space where we change it every 3 months. And right now, that area is an exhibit called Indomitable, the life and art of Camille Brock Baumgartner. And she was an artist who lived in Everglades City in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and did everything from oil painting to watercolors to life castings of the Seminole tribe. James Billy was the chief back then. He's chief again, but he was very, very interested in preserving the Seminole history and heritage. And, you know, when he met her and saw these life castings that she was doing, he had her do castings of 13 tribal elders, and we have one of them on loan right now. They're all 13 are at Seminole headquarters in Hollywood. But we do things like that, you know, anything that tells another story that is somehow connected and explains a little bit about the life in Everglades City or the greater Everglades area. Some of the exhibits are, you know, date back 1,000 years. Some are, you know, 10, 20, 50 years ago. So it's a pretty wide variety, but it's focused on the local history.
And Marie, it's an awesome little museum. 5 or 6 years. Have you been out there? It's
well, I actually, my husband and I think 2 years ago took a ride to Everglades City and looked around. I wish I had known about the museum. I would have loved to go in. Maybe we'll do another trip when we get a little cabin fever here.
I went as a part of the leadership Monroe County class and loved it so much that I took my whole family, my parents, my grandparents, my cousins. We made a weekend trip and stayed at the Rod and Gun Club and took them all to the little museum. I mean, it's not huge by any stretch of the imagination, but everything in it is so well done, and the exhibits are really well developed and professional looking. That not at all what I was expecting to find, because you're kind of in the middle of nowhere out there, but it's well worth the visit.
Thank you.
I want to jump back real quick about the it wasn't about the Aboriginal people. It wasn't just the Europeans that really caused the downfall of the Colusa, Tequesta, Matacumbe. It was also the introduction of the group that would become known as the Seminole, who would come down on raiding parties. There was also, you know, we think of, you know, as the Seminoles, as really the historic Indians that came down, but there was lots of fighting between the Aboriginal people and these Indians who were being forced as America became settled and more people, are pushing those people out, that those Creeks and the Muskogee and those other, cultures that were, fighting for a place to live and fighting, for their own homeland, were also coming down to South Florida. And there was some, it wasn't just the Europeans who got rid of the Aboriginals at all. There was also, there was also, infighting or fighting between, these other tribes coming in trying to find a home of their own, which they did and succeeded and are still around today.
Brad, I just want to make sure you saw that Jeff has a hand raised.
I see that now. Jeff.
Hi. I was a little confused on Charles's last statement about an alternate route for the Flagler Railroad through the Everglades. Did I misunderstand that?
Thomas.
That was actually something that they explored early on. That was looking at the possibility of jumping off from the very tip of the Florida Peninsula and going straight across to Key West rather than following the line of the Keys. And they were looking for what was going to be the best, most practical, most economical. And yeah, they did an exploratory trip, sent surveyors and engineers out into the Everglades to see if it was feasible. And they came back and said, absolutely not.
And William Crome, of Crome Avenue, he was the one who led that expedition down into the Everglades. But he also explored a route that would have taken him across kind of Key Largo out to Carey's Fort Reef, basically, to Turtle Harbor, creating a very long system of bridges that would have been a seaport out in that area. So actually, the route to Key West was at least number 3 on the list of things they explored to do.
So you're suggesting that Key West wasn't always the intended place for Flagler to terminate his railroad?
I think for Flagler that it was initially, because it was such a busy port, and when he made the announcement in 1905 that he was going to do it, yeah, that was definitely the intended target. But a lot of things happened. The plan changed several times over the course of the construction, and at one point he had no intention of going any further than Marathon. That was going to be the terminus right there. And as Brad said, I think that there was an earlier version where it wasn't even going to come that far. It was just going to go straight out and stick into the Atlantic there.
And also, Jeff, Key West wasn't really where Flagler wanted to go. Flagler wanted to go to Havana. So when the train got to Key West, all those cars were loaded onto ferries that brought those trains to Havana. And I believe that Flagler did some purchasing of farmlands and other areas in Cuba, and which ended up being the downfall kind of the farming industry in the Keys, because when those train cars got to Havana, they were loaded up with produce and all kinds of materials that were brought back to the mainland and shipped up to northern markets. But Flagler charged a higher tariff to the local farmers in the Keys than he did to the let's say pineapple farmers down in Havana. So the Keys farmers could not compete with the Cuban farmers, and kind of put the pineapple industry specifically the pineapple industry out of reach.
Yeah, it's all about trade and commerce. I mean, I think that it's important to remember that Flagler's announcement that, yeah, we're going to build this railroad coincides exactly with the time that the U.S. says, hey, we're going to take over construction of the Panama Canal. Flagler wanted to be the guy that owned the closest deep water port once ships started coming in through the proposed Panama Canal. So it didn't really matter if it was down in Key West or if it jutted out into the Atlantic, 40 miles up, further north. It didn't matter. It was just, it needed to be a deep water port somewhere in that area. And the funny thing is that by the time that it was completed, the ships were large enough that they didn't really need to stop to refuel at that time. So,
well, thank you to both of you.
Thank you. All right, we're approaching the 7 o'clock hour. Yeah, 7 o'clock hour. Does anybody else have any questions? I can't read that, Jill.
Just a reminder that I wanted to invite you all to our lecture next Wednesday, a live virtual lecture. It'll be the history and images of Dry Tortuga National Park. It's Wednesday, January 13th from 6 to 7. This very consistent time. And you go to keysdiscovery.com/lectures to register, and hope to see some of you at that lecture as well.
And we'll have a link on our Facebook page on Sunday and Wednesday. They'll promote the event and have a link there as well.
Hey, Brad, I had a question.
Yes.
You talk about these freshwater wells throughout the Keys. Are any of them still in use, or do all your fresh water come from the mainland?
All comes from a processing area up in Homestead. It's all piped in.
When I lived in Key West, there were still in the cemetery a few water faucets that were connected allegedly to the fresh water there. And there were a lot of locals that swore by that water. There were big signs about it all over saying, do not drink this water, non-potable. But there were people that said, best water you'll ever drink. It's good for you, and would go there. I used to cut through there on my bicycle on my way to work, and very often early in the morning you'd see somebody there filling up jug after jug after jug from those spigots. I think that by the time that I left Key West, they locked them up because they were trying to keep that from happening. But yeah, I mean, there are people that swore by the well water down in Key West at least. And I think that if somebody has a secret freshwater hole, they're probably drinking from it and not telling anybody.
Wow.
It also takes about 2 weeks for water to go from Homestead to Key West. It's a very intricate. Yeah, it takes 10 days to 2 weeks for a drop of water to go from Homestead all the way down to Key West through the pipeline, according to the Florida Keys Aqueduct Authority, Jill. Bruce, yes.
So hold on, sorry. So there must have been a period of probably hundreds of years between the time that these fresh water sources dried up and water was delivered from Homestead. So what happened in between?
I'm not sure hundreds of years. I don't think it was, because even in the 1800s, there's still many accounts of freshwater wells by Honda, Lower Matacumbe, Key West. So it was really probably the latter half of the, probably the turn of the century before, like some of the, I think like by Honda, that water turned from freshwater to brackish. I think in like the mid-1800s, I think by 1870, 1880, that well had, sometimes when hurricanes would come over, a strong hurricane, but for instance, 1935 hurricane, blows across and blows all this sand, and sometimes those water sources get filled up due to just the relocation of this land. But it was after the turn of the century, because constructing Flatbush Railroad was a huge, like 5 million gallons a month or something like that, to quench the thirst of the workers, and also the machinery required. So there was definitely, and a lot of that water came from Manatee Creek, about mile marker 115 on what's today the 18-mile stretch. That was a big surprising source of fresh water. For instance, on Indian Key, about 1908, 1909, Indian Key served as a as a station, a workstation during construction of Flatbush Railroad. And
Right.
there's a little kind of a hole in the ground there that they call the mystery feature. And during about 1908, Flatbush workers were trying to drill down there looking for fresh water sources, and they just could not find one there.
Huh. Interesting.
And I think that what water sources there were, I mean, and I don't know the science of it because I'd read things that one referred to it as a quote unquote rain replenished aquifer. But think about the population wise that initially you didn't have that many people who were drawing from these wells. And when you get projects like Brad was talking about, where you have all these workers up and down the Keys, but with Key West, one of the biggest problems was the military base, the Navy base. And that's when they really started changing from drawing well water to we have to bring water in. They're bringing casks in, building water towers, making sure that everybody had a cistern, that sort of thing. Because whatever the water supply was there, it couldn't support 1,000 soldiers at Fort Taylor.
And it was the Navy who paid for, basically had that water, that first water pipe coming down from the mainland all the way to Key West to support the military. And that was one of the primary reasons. Jeff, do you have a question? Your hand is up, or is that just from an earlier one?
Apologize, I was from early.
No worries, no worries. All right.
Thomas or Brad, is it safe to say that nobody current present day drinks from or utilizes any of the freshwater wells in the Keys?
If they do, they're not talking about it.
Huh.
And I'd be curious where those wells. I'm sure there's a cistern somewhere still operating. Someone still. That was every house. Especially for the pioneers in the 1800s, always built cisterns. With the pipes coming off the roof to gather fresh water. Indian Keys, theirs date back to the early 1800s, 1830s, 1840s, and there's so many other cisterns. Cisterns was a way of life back in the pioneer days.
Yeah, and it totally influenced the architecture. Like one of the house styles that you see in Key West is called the zigzag house. You get as much roof surface as you possibly can so you can channel to several different pipes into a cistern. So it was definitely, the cisterns were something that were necessary for everybody. But
and the aqueduct currently encourages a modern day version of that, not for potable water, of course, but they encourage you to install rainwater collection systems for watering your plants, washing cars, boats, things like that. We have big cubes that we can store over 1,000 gallons of water coming off our roof for watering the plants and that sort of thing. And the aqueduct will give you rebates if you install something like that. I mean, we bought restaurant grade containers off of Craigslist and made them ourselves for not a lot of money, but you can store a lot of water that way. I'm going back to my roots.
And her roots are deep, Miss Muir.
Is that still a big thing in the Keys as far as cisterns? Do residential and business places use that?
No.
When I was a few years ago, I was in St. Croix, and quite a few of the places down there, both residents and commercial places, still use that system where they capture the rainwater. Almost every house you went by, you saw these. The roof was designed so that there was a gutter system, and instead of just draining into the ground, it went into and they captured the fresh water.
I imagine there's probably not a big aquifer underneath the Virgin Islands, where we're lucky enough to have one here in South Florida.
Yeah.
All right. You have a cute cat there, Meredith.
Gentlemen, thank you very much.
thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for
Thanks,
being
everybody.
with us, and I hope you keep engaging with us as our programming continues for the.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Brad and I, you know, nothing's going to keep us apart, and we're going to continue to help each other out and hopefully do some collaborations in the not so distant future.
I'm liking the conch versus cracker culture.
I like that. All right. We'll wrap it up for tonight then. Everyone stay well. Happy New Year and keep healthy and safe.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Good to see your faces.